In this lecture, we'll be covering the history of economic development in Africa. Obviously, Africa is a large region containing a large number of countries, and it's not going to be possible in the space of one lecture to say something about every one of the individual countries. I have emphasised through the course how important I think it is to understand the historical details of individual countries to understand their history of economic development. Nevertheless, I think it's the case that economic historians have seen enough commonality in the historical experience of economic development in Africa to make it worthwhile thinking about Africa as a whole and trying to develop a schematic overview of what's happened to economic development in that region. In this overview, I've got a few charts and graphs to begin giving that overview of the history of economic development. First of all, a graph from the Madison dataset, which we've used frequently throughout the course, showing GDP per capita for different regions in the world from AD1 through to 2010. And there's a couple of points that come out from this graph. First of all, the idea that the period from 1820 to 1950, when the areas like Western Europe and the Western offshoots are starting to develop at a more rapid pace, Africa is not developing with those other countries in the world. And so this is the phase of history that we refer to as the Great Divergence, and Africa is one of the countries that isn't developing in the same way that other regions in the world did. You can see that in that period, Africa is not alone, that Asia is also not developing in the way that other regions of the world were. Then we get to a second phase from 1950 to 2010, where you can see that in that phase, Asia does begin to develop more rapidly, and there's development in Africa as well, quite rapid by historical standards, but nevertheless not as rapid as the development that's occurring still in other parts of the world in that 50 years. So if you like, this is a graph showing the idea of Africa falling behind and making the point that in some ways you can think of that occurring in two stages, that there's no takeoff in growth in Africa in the period from 1820 to 1950. Asia also has that experience. Then from 1950 to 2010, there is some more rapid economic development in Africa, but it still involves falling behind, for example, against Asia, which is developing more rapidly during that period. We can break down the experience since 1950 into particular decades, and you can see from this table that in the 1950s and 1960s there's relatively, by historical standards, rapid growth in Africa, but then in the 1970s and 1980s that really stops, and growth in Africa stalls for a couple of decades. From the 1990s onwards, there's a more positive picture about economic growth in Africa, with a resumption of positive rates of economic growth and rates of economic growth that, again, are very strong by historical standards. In the next graph, I've focused in for that 50-year period on a group of large African countries. So in this graph, I've got countries which had over 30 million population at the end of the last decade. And there's several points that come out from this graph. First of all, you see that these economies predominantly are poor economies with incomes that even at the end of the period after that growth, you had GDP per capita less than $2,000. The exception is South Africa, which is one of the southern African nations which tend to have higher GDP per capita, higher levels of income. If you look at the evolution of GDP per capita in each of these countries during the 60-year period from 2010, you see that each of the countries has had an experience that's broadly similar to the aggregate that I was describing in the previous table, that there was some growth from 1950 through to 1970, but then the 1970s and 1980s are really periods of decline in GDP per capita, after which there's been a resumption of economic growth. So predominantly poor countries by world standards, and a degree of commonality in the experience, the development experience in the last 60 years. But even with the growth of the 1990s and 2000s, these economies still ending up being, on a world standard, poor economies. Not only that, but if we want to think about well-being across the population as a whole in these African economies, it's important to be aware that some of the countries which had quite strong rates of growth in the 1990s and 2000s are countries where there's a relatively high degree of inequality. So there's an issue about the degree to which the gains from economic growth during the period of the 1990s and the 2000s, or even going back to the 1950s, have been shared amongst the population. This is a chart where I've included the same group of large African countries from the previous chart, and then I've included countries from the United Nations Human Development Report who are in the top 10 in the Human Development Index, for which information is available on a measure of inequality known as the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a commonly used approach to measuring inequality. It's an index that goes from 0 to 1, where 0 would be perfect equality, everyone with the same level of income or GDP, and 1 is a situation of perfect inequality, if you like, where there was one person in society who really controlled all the resources or earned all the income. So on this graph, we've got on the vertical axis a measure of inequality, and on the horizontal axis the rate of growth in GDP per capita from 2000 to 2010. And the point of this graph is to see that the top 10 in the Human Development Index, they had rates of growth in the 2000s that by and large were below the rates of growth in the African countries. So that's, for example, the effect of the global financial crisis keeping down the rate of growth in those countries. Also the fact that they're more mature, developed economies, so they've done the catch-up and convergence. Whereas African economies in the large African countries had higher rates of economic growth during this decade. But the other point to note is that they also tend to have higher levels of inequality than these countries, for example, Norway, Canada, New Zealand, who are in the top 10 on the Human Development Index. And so the point is that while there was this stronger economic growth in Africa during this period and in some previous decades, some of that is going to be offset by the fact that that growth is not being evenly distributed or is being less evenly distributed amongst the population than in other parts of the world. So if we had to give an overall description of economic development in Africa, and in particular I should say I'm going to be talking about sub-Saharan Africa primarily during this lecture, so we're excluding Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria and Libya. We're talking about the countries below that in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a variety of common features. First of all, if you look at the United Nations Human Development Index, the most recent 2013 report, which has the measures for 2012, no member of the group of 47 countries that the UN classifies as having very high human development are in Africa. Whereas if you go to the bottom level, low human development, only 10 out of the 46 countries aren't in Africa. Paul Collier, who has written the well-known book, The Bottom Billion, about the poorest billion population in the world, 70% of that bottom billion are in Africa. It's in terms of where economic development's up to, in most African countries, it's still the case that economic activity is based around primarily rural-based activities, with the population engaged working in low productivity agriculture. and associated with this low level of economic development is low life expectancy, standards of literacy and education attainment. This is summarised in this data, which comes from the most recent Human Development Report for 2012. So the left-hand column is the Human Development Index, the summary measure that the United Nations constructs to give a perspective on human development. So you can see that the very high development countries are 0.905 on this index, Sub-Saharan Africa 0.475, which is below any of the other major regions that the United Nations identifies, such as East Asia and Pacific, Latin Caribbean, South Asia, or the Arab states. If you look at life expectancy, you see that that is below these other regions in the world and about 25 years below countries with very high development. Years of schooling, again below virtually all the other regions except for South Asia, and about 2.5 times less than in very high development countries. And gross national income per capita, which is another measure of economic capacity, command over goods and services, you can see that there's a factor of about 16 between that in Sub-Saharan Africa and in very high development regions. So huge disparities in level of economic development and human well-being between Sub-Saharan Africa and most other regions in the world, and in particular very high development regions. One of the issues in Africa has been the very high rates of population growth in recent years, for example in the past 50 years. This graph benchmarks population of all these regions at 100 in 1820, and so you can interpret the numbers in this graph as being the proportionate growth in population relative to 1820. The big grower, of course, is Western offshoots. That's the countries like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, to which there was major migration from Europe in this period after 1820. But then you see in Western Europe, East Asia, former USSR, relatively slow rates of growth consistently across this period. But in Latin America and in Africa, there's been relatively high rates of growth in population, which are putting pressure on the growth in GDP per capita to be manifested in higher levels of which is putting pressure on growth in GDP to translate into higher levels of growth in GDP per capita. Now, that's an overview for Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. It is important, as I said at the start, to recognise heterogeneity within Africa. The fact that there are over 50 countries, the fact that there's diversity in geography, the location of countries, the size of land mass, their natural resources, differences in history, the process and extent of colonisation, the population size, and also differences in economic development and living standards. And so just to give a brief perspective on that, there are countries that are coastal versus landlocked. There are countries that are resource rich, which have extensive holdings of diamonds and oil, versus countries that really primarily consist of low quality farmland, or at least that's the knowledge of their resource base at the present. You've got countries such as Sao Tome and Principe, which has a population of only about 200,000 on the most recent numbers, versus Nigeria, population of over 160 million. You've got big differences in income as well. Botswana, which had a GNI of 13,100, so that's a level about a third of the very high development countries, so that puts Botswana into the medium development group, compared to the Republic of Congo, which is right at the bottom on the GNI scale, which has only $319 per capita. You get a sense of that diversity when you look at a map of the continent. You get a sense of the very different sizes of countries, from small countries such as Equatorial Guinea to larger countries such as South Africa. There's countries which are on the coast, for example Somalia, Kenya, and there are countries which are landlocked, such as Uganda, Sudan, and Chad, Niger, and so You also see the spread of latitudes across which Africa extends. So we've got the Tropic of Capricorn here, the Tropic of Cancer up here. And so you can see that predominantly sub-Saharan Africa fits into the tropics, but there are some areas that also are below the tropics, which would be more temperate zone areas. So a lot of geographic diversity in Africa, a lot of differences in economic outcomes, which is important to keep in mind as we proceed through in thinking about Africa, the region as a whole, and its economic development. In the rest of this lecture, I'm going to begin by giving a refresher on geography, institutions and culture, what I termed right back at the start of the course as the fundamental determinants of economic development. I'm going to talk about 3 stages of the evolution of African economic development. First of all, talking about some reasons why historically Africa had been a relatively poor region. Secondly, talking about the phase of colonialism in Africa. And thirdly, talking about what's happened in Africa after independence. Then I'm going to finish up with 2 more specific topics. The first of those will be an idea which extends beyond Africa, which has been seen to have particular application to Africa, an idea called the resource curse. And then the last section of the lecture will be to talk about 2 economies that have been seen as relatively successful within Africa, Botswana and Mauritius, and talk about case studies that have been done of those 2 countries that have tried to understand the basis for their economic performance. In the next section of this lecture, I'll do a refresher on geography, institutions and culture.